who serve embracing tobacco harm reduction, please welcome the Hill's contributing editor, Kathleen Koch.
Good morning. Good morning, and happy St. Paddy's Day. I've indulged in a bit of the wearing of the green. I'm married to someone of Irish descent, so he would have it no other way. And I see many of you have joined me, so welcome. This is just such an important topic that we're here to discuss today. I don't know how many in the room have members, active duty, or veterans in their family. I'm just curious. Yeah. And this topic, our topic, is serving those who serve, embracing tobacco harm reduction. And though tobacco use, as you may know, has been declining in the United States as a whole, for service members and military veterans, they continue to have higher rates of tobacco use than civilians. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, cigarettes still remain the #1 preventable cause of death in the United States. Isn't that just a shame? And veterans smoke cigarettes, as I said, at significantly higher rates than the national average. So today we're going to explore how something called tobacco harm reduction can impact the smoking behavior of communities in the U.S., like the military, that are the most affected by tobacco use. I'd like to thank our sponsor, PMI US, for their support of this discussion today. And please, if you would like to join in the discussion on social media, the hashtag is #TheHillHealth. And we are kicking off the show today with the Department of War's top doctor. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Ferrara. He is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of War for Health Affairs and Chief Operating Officer of the Military Health System. That's a mouthful, so thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Dr. Ferrara, I'd like to start right out asking you, since you are the top doctor, basically, for our military, what is the greatest threat to their health today?
Sure. And I'll start by saying, first of all, thank you to the Hill for having me and for PMI for sponsoring this really, really important topic. One of the great things about military medicine is we're intensely focused on population health. That is, it's making sure force health protection and to ensure that the warfighter has the troops they need. So how do we do that holistically? And so what I would say is, I could say it's orthopedics, or I could say it's mental health, or I could say it's a variety of things. But what I think it really boils down to is resilience. It's how do we instill resilience into our fighting force? Because we ask so much of them. You're seeing the USS Ford. It's on the longest deployment in naval history. How do we make sure that our service members have that inner strength? And that's mind and body. And so again, why I think that blends well with this topic, because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about, is how people use different things, whether it's food, whether it's cigarettes, whether it's other habits, whether it's as a crutch or as an aid to help them, deal with that stress that we ask them to endure.
I said that the rates were higher, but I was wondering, can you give us numbers? What are the numbers as far as the percentage of our service members who smoke cigarettes and then, say, veterans?
Sure. So it's in the roughly 30% range are still using tobacco, and that carries through to veterans as well.
And the public at large is about 9%, 9.9%.
Yeah, so I think we're in the 20 to 30. So it's usually about twice the rate. And there's of course geographic variance, and when we talk about difference in the ranks and so forth, we have more tobacco use, more cigarette use amongst our enlisted service members than our officer corps and so forth. And we talk about all those things, and is that because of different stressors we put on them, I think is a very important thing, but also the social factors too, right? As we all know,
it's been part of the military culture. I mean, for years, cigarettes were given
to our
service members when they deployed.
That's right. Smoke them if you got them. How many times have we heard that uttered in cinema, right, or anywhere? So I think those are imbued in the culture. And, it's a way to gather amongst people. You can go have a smoke break. It's a way to be with your band of brothers, if you will. Or sisters, exactly. So yes, of course, in the euphemistic way, band of brothers. But that's right. And so that provides that kind of off-ramp. So how do we change the behavior, and how do we get folks away from using cigarettes as
how
that
do
means?
we do that? Because, that is, a sea change, no pun intended.
It is.
It is so ingrained. And, what do you see? What is step one? How are you approaching it?
Well, we're doing a lot, and I think it's really an all hands on deck, to continue the metaphor. It's an all hands on deck. It's not just the medical folks, but I think it starts at day one. I'm excited. We've done a lot of things over the past several years. There's no tobacco use in boot camp, for example, so or inside buildings, and we've narrowed where those areas are. And when I joined the Navy 35 years ago, and I spent a lot of time on ship, and it was amazing because, and they have a tradition in the Navy that I think we're inherit from the British Navy, of the smoking lamp. So they'll announce overhead, well, the smoking lamp is lit, or the smoking lamp is extinguished.
What does that mean?
That means because you can't be outside the skin of the ship after dark. So it usually goes with
Safety
dusk
reasons,
and dawn,
right.
for safety reasons, exactly. So they announce, it's a formal thing. They do sweepers, man your brooms. They have all these little rituals that are part of shipboard life, but the smoking lamp is one of them. And so, I remember, because people had trouble not smoking through the night sometimes, you'd go in these fan rooms and people were just all in there, and it was, like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, the door opens and all this smoke comes out, except it was cigarettes. It wasn't anything else. But because, it was a struggle, and I see a lot of progress, over the 35 years that I've been associated with the military. We have more room to go, but we're doing things. Like I said, the culture has changed dramatically. The amount of people I see that are smoking is less. I think people see it as is not an option, and what the theme of this conference is about is tobacco harm reduction. So how are we going to do things that are intermediate, or that are not as toxic to folks as combustible cigarettes? So I think that's a lot. And I also want to say, I'm sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but we have so many things we're doing. Just in January of this year, we published a DoD-VA joint clinical practice guideline on tobacco cessation. So that's really exciting. There's only 28 of those CPGs, we call them, across all of medicine, and tobacco is our newest one, tobacco cessation. So that's something I think is really important.
So who starts that conversation with the service member? Where does it begin? Is it with the physician? Is it with the commanding officer?
Back to all options. It's everyone. So we do something called a periodic health assessment. At least once a year, you have to check in with medical as a readiness test. And one of the questions on there is we ask about tobacco use. And then if somebody, and the first thing, if the answer is yes, then we start to talk about how can we do cessation. And we have the whole armamentarium of pharmacologic, behavioral therapies, all those things to help people, including other, adjunctive therapies to try to get people to get away from cigarettes. But also, it's the culture and the command. That's really important because, again, back to the social and the cultural points we talked about earlier, the commanding officer really owns the culture of their unit. That's a very important part of military culture.
Model behavior.
That's right. And so if you see your colonels out there smoking, then that sort of condones it. So I think leadership does see that very much as part of their role as well.
So what are you finding works? Now, you mentioned tobacco harm reduction. Can you explain exactly what that is?
Sure. So combustible cigarettes are the most, and as I think you might have talked about in your opening remarks, number one cause of preventable death in the United States. And I'm a vascular and interventional radiologist. So over my career, I've taken care of a lot of folks with critical limb ischemia, stroke, that are sequelae of cigarette smoking from past years. And so we're trying to get folks away from the combustible cigarettes. So how do we do that? So again, we can do that with the things we talked about, like in the CPG things, whether it's whether it's medications, whether it's behavioral therapy, and other things we're doing that are less harmful. So we're looking at nicotine replacement or other things that will satisfy or try to give people a bridge so that they can not get the most toxic part of the tobacco experience as a way to eventually get to full cessation.
So tobacco harm reduction is really isn't that focusing on getting someone on from, if you can't quit, right?
That's right.
If you can't use the behavioral therapy and the medications, to try something different.
Right. No, that's exactly right.
That
because
still has nicotine and still has some health effects.
I think what we want to avoid is saying that the enemy of good is
perfect is the enemy of good.
Yeah, that's right. So we want to do that and say, look, ideally people aren't using any kind of exogenous. People are eating a healthy diet, they're exercising, they're getting tons of sleep.
In the perfect
that would be
world.
Wonderful.
Right.
That's not the realistic world. That's not the world we live in. So we look at saying, how can we mitigate the most harmful behaviors and with a path? And again, that's where the partnership with, whether it's with your medical community, whether it's with your friends or your family or your command structure, to continue to work that journey from the most harmful behavior to ideally to not a harmful behavior with all the intermediate waypoints.
What about prevention? Mm-hmm. How important is that in the military, and what role does the military health provider play in that?
Oh, well, that's, when I mentioned, to us, one of the things that I've enjoyed about being part of military medicine for 35 years is what I mentioned earlier. We are all about health and not health care. The way we succeed on the battlefield, of which we're in active combat operations as we speak, is by having a healthy, fit force. And so prevention is everything. If, one of the number one causes for our folks to not be able to fight is things like tendinitis, like musculoskeletal injuries and things like that. So we're always looking at it. And so so prevention is in our DNA. So that applies to tobacco use as well. Like I said, it used to be at boot camp or in other places like that, cigarette smoking was encouraged. Now it's actually not allowed. And so we start from day one. If you're in a training environment, you can't have that, get those habits started, because what we know is the hardest thing is breaking the habit. So the best way to avoid it is to just not begin. Never start. Right. That's right.
You mentioned fit to fight. How does tobacco use, cigarette smoking in particular, impact military readiness?
Adversely. So it impacts it adversely. I think that was also one of the old myths where people said, it makes it, but it increases your alertness and increases all these things, because that was sort of the mythology of it. But what we know now is it actually leads to slower wound healing, slower injury healing.
Really?
Absolutely. Especially
the cardiovascular.
The cardiovascular, right. Exactly. And we're, fitness is one of the big things for us. And so cigarette smoking, as we know, is not good for your cardiovascular system. So we know that those kind of healthy lifestyles are all self-reinforcing.
Before we came on stage, you and I were talking about the mental health side of this.
Sure.
Because I know prevention has got to be so difficult when cigarettes are something that so many people turn to relieve stress, to relieve anxiety, and those are, often part and parcel of the job. I was texting with my brother-in-law, who's retired Navy, and he said, it's tough when your job involves putting on a flak jacket and going outside the wire, not knowing who's trying to kill you that day.
Right.
And he served in Iraq, Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank him for his service. I really appreciate your family's commitment to the country. But it is, and again, it's a holistic look. And I think one of the things the Army is leading the way on this right now is something called H2F, holistic health and fitness, that are on many of our infantry bases, or we have infantry divisions. And it really is exactly what it sounds like, holistic health and fitness. It's an opportunity for people to be, if they have musculoskeletal things, to see physical therapy, not getting a referral from your doctor, to have exercise, nutrition, behavioral health, and also a sense of community, because they're meeting there in the mornings. As you know, one of the traditions of the military is morning PT and stuff like that. So again, when we can form those social bonds and those other kind of touch points with folks that are positive, instead of sort of threaded with negative behaviors, then we're really helping folks. And I think that really ends up paying off. What I mentioned at the beginning is resilience. And, to what your brother-in-law talked about is how do you get yourself to go run towards the gunfire? We ask people to run towards the gunfire. That takes a lot of resilience, and to get folks to be in a state of mind that they can do that and do it successfully. And I'm incredibly proud of our service members and our troops, the way they perform, and they do it incredibly well. And they do that by, you can't cram for that. You have to do that over time. That is something, you can't plan to be prepared. You just have to be prepared, right? Mm-hmm. And so we do that, again, from day one, when they enter boot camp, when they're putting their feet on those yellow shoe marks at Paris Island or MCRD, and it goes throughout their career.
I'm wondering, is technology at all proving to be helpful? Are there, telehealth programs, digital health tools, anything out there, either currently in use or in the offing, that could help reduce tobacco use among service members and veterans?
Yeah, absolutely. In addition to what the industry is doing with it is a form of technology, right? To have these, these waypoints of things that are not combustible tobacco, which is the most harmful form of tobacco. So other things that are the harm reduction. But what you're referring to is things with behavioral health or with other things people can do. We do a lot of virtual behavioral health now, especially we're a worldwide operation. I have service members in every time zone on the planet, in every hemisphere. And so I can't have a psychologist or psychiatrist with every service member, not on every ship or every submarine. So we really have leaned into technology. It's an exciting time to be in medicine with what's going on in AI, and we're being able to leverage those things not only for diagnostics but therapeutics, but also the way we run our operations, the way we're improving the quality of life for our folks. So that's a very exciting area for us, and really there's a huge appetite for it. We're dealing with digital natives. Most of our service members are, much younger than I am, and so they grow up very comfortable with technology, and some of them actually prefer a virtual encounter to a face-to-face.
I understand that. It's easier to get to, and then you don't have that stigma of someone seeing you coming or going.
That's right. And again, back to mental health is all about, all options have to be on the table. You have to meet people where they are. And I think that's truly a patient-centered or a service member, really a person-centered approach, is to say, how do we find people in the way that I'm a people person, so I'd much rather talk to you like this than over a Zoom meeting or something. But, for others it'd be different. And so I think we're trying to really use all multimodal channels to be able to do that.
I'm wondering about continuity of care. So when someone leaves active duty, and many then transition from the military health system to the VA healthcare system, how do you ensure seamless treatment then, and the continuity of care when you're talking about these long-term health risks like tobacco usage?
Yeah. That's a great question, and that's one of our top priorities for both department secretaries. So for those who are unfamiliar, the military health system through the Department of War and the VA are separate. We are separate department, cabinet level departments, but we're really, to me, it's a continuity because everyone in the VA system was in the military, was in uniform. By definition, they have to be. So having that smooth transition, we're working on something right now called 0-day service treatment record, meaning, I hung up the uniform on April 30th, 2016. It's a sad day for me. I still remember it when I got my DD-214 and knew I wasn't going to put the uniform on again, and it was very bittersweet after 25 years. But what we want, which we didn't have then, but we're a lot closer to now, is the next day I can pull my records, I can go to the VA, I can get care for whether it's orthopedic care, whether it's cardiovascular care, whether it's mental health, whether it's maybe in my last 2 weeks in the military I decided, I'm in a new chapter of my life, whether I serve for 25 years or 4 years, part of my new chapter is I'm going to stop smoking. Well, if we started that for you 2 weeks, we're not going to say we're not going to treat you 2 weeks before you leave. Absolutely, we'll get you taken care of. And then we need to pass the baton to the VA. So the VA, and that's why we have that joint clinical practice guideline. You can see that we are sort of hand in glove with that. And that's as it should be for the folks who serve their country.
So as we wrap, if you could flip a switch and get the Pentagon or get policymakers to do one thing that would most reduce tobacco-related disease among the military, what would it be? One thing you could just
One thing, if I had the magic wand, I think we would just, really have a culture where we model the behavior that we never get folks started. We just have a way so that people just don't begin, and then we're not dealing with the issue. But until then, because I don't have the magic wand, we are going to do everything from all the things we talked about and more to mitigate that risk and continue our tobacco harm reduction techniques.
Dr. Stephen Ferrara, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of War for Health Affairs. Thank you so much for
thank you,
joining
Kathleen.
me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Brian Urkula, who is head of the U.S. Scientific Engagement at PMI US, in conversation with the Hill's Senior Vice President of Programming, Sarah Catt.
Good morning, Dr. Urkel. Thank you for joining us today. We know that tobacco use remains high among veterans and service members. What motivates you to address this issue?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at smoking overall in this country, right, if we think, decades back, smoking rates were 30, 40% of the population. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard, in the last week, 9.9%. We're at the lowest record level in history, and that's fantastic. But I think those numbers can sort of hide the picture a little bit because that progress has not been even. And there are definitely populations who smoke more than others. For instance, if we think about the younger cohorts, those in their 20s, they're barely smoking now. But when we think about older Americans, people with mental health conditions, and veterans, that rate is still much higher than that national average. So I think we need to celebrate the advances that we've made, but also keep focused and look at those populations where we can still do work. So I've been working on tobacco and nicotine issues for a really long time, and including at the FDA, and I was writing talking points for the FDA to talk about smoking in America, what we can do, how we can put the preventable deaths in history, right? But the one person I wasn't really talking to about this was my father. And so, like many people in this room, I was born in Fort Leonard Wood. My father has a wonderful history where he's from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I don't know if anyone's ever been there. It's very early man, and he was a hockey player, and he got hit in the face with a puck and lost a lot of his teeth. And he was very embarrassed about this, and he didn't want to go to school, and he didn't know what to do, and so he signed up. And the Army gave him teeth, the Army gave him a GED, the Army gave him a chance to see the world. And I'm very proud to be part of that military family tradition. Anyone who's been part of it knows, when you meet another military family, you get along right away. You all respect that service and that camaraderie. And so, I didn't really talk to him about it. He was my father. He was a ROTC instructor. He was not someone you really wanted to tell what to do. But sadly, on May 9th, 2024, Master Sergeant Wesley Paul Urkula, he lost his life to COPD and lung cancer because he started smoking very young. He tried patches, he tried all of those things, but he never did quit. And so, not only is this professionally very important to me, this is what I've dedicated my career to, but personally, it didn't have to happen, and I kind of see it as my goal to ensure that as few Americans, particularly veterans, follow the steps of my father and lose their life because of smoking.
Thank you for sharing that story. Yeah. So what does the science say around harm reduction, and how can tobacco harm reduction reduce their reliance on cigarettes?
Yeah, so when we think about smoking and how it causes almost 500,000 deaths a year in this country, why is that? And the reason is combustion. So there was a researcher, Michael Russell, very, very respected, and he said, people smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the tar. And that's because when you light a cigarette, when you combust anything, you create smoke. And that smoke contains thousands of chemicals, carcinogens that cause cancer, cardiovascular toxicants, respiratory toxicants. And the nicotine, on the other hand, nicotine, while addictive, is not the driver of this disease, right? It does not cause cancer. And so if, lately, in the last 20 years or so, we have these new smoke-free products which are able to deliver the nicotine, which can help move people away from the cigarettes, but it doesn't deliver all those harmful chemicals, right? So the science on this is evolving, but it is already quite deep. So, the FDA has been quite clear that combusted products exist sort of at the top of this risk continuum. And smoke-free products present much less risk due to that reduced exposure to harmful toxins. So when someone who is a smoker switches to something like a nicotine pouch or an e-cigarette or something like that, they immediately have lower levels of these toxins in their body, and that leads to a lot of improvements that we can already see. If we look markers of inflammation, free radical damage, all of those things improve when people switch to these smoke-free products. So, the science is there, the problem is there, but I think we have a bit of an awareness problem in this country. Most people think nicotine causes cancer. It does not. And so that hinders people's ability to sort of transition from that most harmful product to something, that delivers nicotine that's much less harmful.
So why do you think these non-combustible alternatives are good for the veterans community?
Yeah, so again, I can't help but go to my father, and again, he's not someone who you would say, don't do that, right? And so I think there's a bit of agency when we talk about moving people away from combusted cigarettes. It's saying, you're in control of this, and you can make a choice to try something that might be less harmful. But right now, again, as I mentioned, the misinformation, most smokers believe nicotine causes cancer. And so if I was still a smoker and someone said, you can get your nicotine from this other product, but without all the harmful chemicals, I would be like, oh, it still has nicotine, so it's still going to be a problem for me. So I think there's a lot of education that we could do with the veteran community to help them understand, I think it breaks down to, if you don't smoke or use tobacco and nicotine products, don't start. And if you do, you should quit. But if you don't quit, right, there are better alternatives out there. These are scientifically substantiated products that you can try to kind of, when we talk about harm reduction, again, as you mentioned, it's perfect being the enemy of good, right? It's not quit or die. It is, hey, there are better alternatives out there for you, and as a population who has served us so well when in the military, and like my father, many veterans go on to continue to in service of their country and their communities. We want you to be here and we want you to do that. So maybe give these other products a try to lower your risk.
So what would you like to see specifically in the veterans community in the near future?
Oh, so many things.
So many.
But we talked about this misinformation, right? And so Rutgers did a study not long ago, and they found that even physicians think that nicotine causes cancer, almost 80%.
Interesting.
And so if your physician doesn't have it right, they're really not in a great position to advise their patients on what the best thing is for their health, okay? So I think there needs to be basic training on nicotine, on smoke-free products, so that if someone comes into the VA and they say, hey, I'm a smoker, I'm thinking about switching to an e-cigarette, I'm thinking about using these nicotine pouches, or I have already started using them a little bit, that physician is equipped to say, okay, you're still going to be getting nicotine, so you have to know that. But the FDA has said this about these products, and so that the patient can make an informed decision, but we need the VA staff and really all of the healthcare community to really understand the science of these products, because then they can best give advice to our men and women who served.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you.
Absolute pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Dr. Urkala. And now we would like to share with you the patient perspective. A few days ago, I had a chance to interview Harvey Graham Green. He's a British Army veteran and a former cigarette smoker. So listen to our interview. Harvey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Harvey, you served in the British Army alongside U.S. forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, in Ukraine. Did a lot of service members around you smoke?
Yes, yeah, it is. It's a long custom of the military. I would say my generation definitely, around 60, 70% of people, particularly in combat units, were using tobacco products.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's a mixture of things. I think there is a tradition, like smoke breaks, socialization. Also, there's a reasonable amount of stress and pressure with the job. And, you know, we talk about the condor moments actually in our training of like taking a step back, having a cigarette, having a think about things. So there's definitely a psychological aspect to it. And then obviously, because it's a social norm, then people become, you know, addicted. And that's kind of the continuation of it.
When did you yourself start smoking?
I started smoking in basic training, like many other veterans. So you could kind of hang out with the group. And it's definitely a coping mechanism. Basic training back in the early 2000s was quite an intense experience. I'm sure it still is now. And it was definitely a coping mechanism.
And would you say, you know, you're a British soldier, but was the same true for U.S. forces that you were around?
Yeah, absolutely. So both campaigns that I served in Afghanistan and Iraq were coalition efforts. I served under U.S. command, and half the people in my units were, you know, Marines or U.S. Army personnel, even some Air Force chaps as well. So yes, it was coalition, very similar. The British Army is very close in its ethos to the U.S. Marine Corps, and we spent a lot of time together in Helmand Province.
So have you ever tried to stop smoking? And if so, what strategies have you tried?
There's several strategies, and I will say that most kind of Western militaries and health services, et cetera, are very good at offering them. Primarily the gum. The gum is a strategy.
Nicotine gum?
But the gum can damage your teeth. And not to make a joke here, but it didn't help my teeth too much. So you have to be quite careful with the gum over time. The patches are a little hit and miss because obviously they can keep you awake at night. And many veterans, you know, have some sleep issues. So anything that interferes with sleep isn't particularly helpful. I tried that. Initially vaping, but the dangers of vaping, I mean, especially with a lot of this stuff not regulated, not built here in the US or, you know, in Europe, that can actually be, there's a lot of horror stories coming from vaping. So those are predominantly the free methods that I tried. None of them particularly worked, and you kind of find a lot of back and forth with tobacco products. But the one thing that has worked and has stuck is Zins. So Zins have been
let's
a fantastic
stop right now.
tool.
Tell people what Zins is. I understand it's a nicotine pouch, correct?
Yeah, it's essentially it's a flavored nicotine pouch, and the ingredients are pretty clear. And the Zins are kind of seen as one of the earlier nicotine pouches that people pick. They're pretty good because they're made in the US and their ingredients are very clear. And it's essentially some flavoring, and then it's a little pouch, and then it has a certain amount of nicotine in there, so you can get the 3 milligram or the 6 milligrams.
And you just put it in your mouth?
Yeah, yep.
Between
exactly
your gums,
that.
I guess?
Yeah, between your gums. I mean, people have different preferences, but yeah, it goes in your mouth. It goes between your gums. And then, you know, some are flavored, some are not flavored. And then the nicotine is absorbed that way. So you don't get any cravings for cigarettes. And actually over time, what you find is it's preferable to cigarettes because you don't get the out of breath experience. You don't get the smell, et cetera, et cetera. So it's preferable as well.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. How have you seen your health changed since stopping cigarette smoking, then using the Zins?
Yeah, that's a really good point. As I approach my early 40s, I have two young children, and one of the main things is I can chase after them and I can still run. Cycling is something that's been fairly big to me, but obviously, while smoking, that's not an option. I will say with the Zins is from a cardiovascular perspective. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I can give my own story. Like I can feel my lungs are a lot clearer. They stay a lot clearer. I'm a lot less likely to get out of breath, on your traditional New York fourth floor walk-ups, or chasing the kids across the park, playing, going on the climbing frames, or, going for walks. So I will say that the health benefits are pretty significant. And I don't also have the worries of, with vaping, what are those chemicals doing? What is in the product? Or within nicotine gum, obviously, cracking another tooth.
So, do you think that tobacco harm reduction strategies, these non-combustible nicotine products, do you think that they've really been adequately explored or addressed or been given a fair shake around the world as an option to cigarette smoking?
Yeah, I think, and public health is obviously complex, but I think the consumer is really proving this, particularly in some of the most regulated countries as well. So remember, this is a European product. There's some very heavily regulated markets. The consumers are picking Zyn over vapes, over nicotine gum, over cigarettes. And I think that's a good thing because it is the least harmful nicotine product. Now, we all know in an ideal world, the least harmful nicotine product is no nicotine products, right? But realistically, like if we look at consumer behavior, considerably less people are smoking. And out of all the alternatives, Zins are being picked. And, we read about stuff, like we do our research. We all heard about the awful kind of popcorn lung risks with vapes and everything else. If you read about it, it's definitely the least harmful nicotine product out there. And people are picking it widely. There's an enormous demand for Zins.
I guess I was asking because, what you tend to hear when it comes to stopping cigarette smoking, from most of the medical community, they recommend, counseling, some behavioral kind of therapy, and then some medications or things like you tried, the nicotine patches or the gums. And it really seems like often kind of a binary choice that they present.
Yeah, it does. And it can be difficult. And I think, like I've done some reading on this. It's about 85% or something astonishing of people who choose alternative products and try to quit tobacco usage fail. So understanding that there is a more comprehensive approach that like the medical community may recommend. We don't always have time for that, right? We're running around, we're busy, we understand the trade-offs in our choices. But Zins are definitely something that people keep picking over and over again. I would say, it's a very good compromise.
What would you say, in your opinion, is the best way to help communities that do have a high rate of cigarette smokers, help them change their daily routines? I mean, communities like the military community.
I think the military has very much so embracing. Very much so. And I have a lot of friends in the military community, some of which are deployed at the moment. And we're engaged in operations, and I'm sure there's plenty of service members who are fueled by Zins right now. It's a cheaper product, it's a safer product, and it's actually a better product. Like it's far nicer to have a Zin than to have a cigarette. So we look at, like, as a community, how do we make our decisions? Decisions fairly easy in terms of it's a better product and it's cheaper and people like it and they prefer it. And I think that's doing a lot of the work. And with the military and the veterans, with the military, fitness is obviously very important, and being able to keep those run times down, which gets harder as the years go on. And Zins obviously give the cardiovascular benefits, so the smokers aren't coughing at the back and they can keep up. Keeps people alert, keeps people focused. So I think within the military community, they've moved, a lot of them have moved from DIP. A lot of my Marine friends have moved from DIP to Zyn. They're seeing better outcomes in terms of their oral health, in terms of their teeth, and also in terms of their lifestyle. So within the military community, like it's a great product that's been fully embraced. And within the veterans community, obviously, due to the exposures that we have on operations, burn pits, etc., we are in a higher risk category. And I think anything that, gets us down a little bit on those additional risk factors is very, very important. I think most veterans and service members are embracing it for that reason.
Well, British Army veteran Harvey Graham Green, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story.
Thank you very much for having me.
And now it is time for our panel discussion, and please join me on stage now. We've got, Chelsea Simone, co-founder and chief health officer at Hunter 7 Foundation. It's a not-for-profit that provides life-saving support for veterans who get sick from their service. Danny Vargas, founder, chairman, and CEO of the American Latino Veterans Association. And Lindsay Lewis, chief executive officer of the Progressive Policy Institute, a Democratic not-for-profit. So,
thank you.
Join me here. So, Chelsea, I wanted to start with you now. You're a nurse, cancer researcher, a veteran, and you're also co-founder of this group called the Hunter 7 Foundation, where you research toxic exposures that military have often suffered during their service, and you help them with the cancers that they often develop as a result of that exposure. So what are your greatest concerns about the level of cigarette smoking and the tobacco use that we see in the military today, and how does that interact with the cancers that you see as well now?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And one thing I think we realized is that looking at what the VA spent alone in disability benefits, compensation, pension, and death benefits, we spend twice as much than we do on actual health care. So in 2025, $236 billion, an increase of 35%, was spent on disability benefits, death benefits at the VA. That's a red flag, especially when you see a 5% decrease in actual health care. So why are we so downstream? Why is this what should be an easy public health approach? What are we failing at? And why are these veterans and service members being diagnosed with late stage, end stage terminal cancers? And so seeing that and seeing these trends of these preventable cancer deaths, we're like, okay, let's make 2026 a risk reduction year. I'm a realist. My husband smokes, now he vapes, and I was actually at the base up the street, and I was like, I'm gonna grab him some Zyn, because I've been influencing him to try to quit. And they weren't for sale there. And so, I think one of the biggest things.
Tobacco, cigarettes were?
Cigarettes were on the shelves, and so wasn't chewing tobacco. And so a big concern, I think, the biggest concern that we see with Hunter 7 and with the veteran population, we support hundreds of thousands of people, whether it be education, thousands of veterans with cancer screening, early identification, cancer care. One of the biggest things we see is that a lot of veterans and service members, along with providers, don't understand the difference between tobacco and nicotine. One's addictive, nicotine. One causes cancer, tobacco. And so that's the foreground of what we need to start with,
Danny, you represent two communities that are heavily impacted by tobacco use, both the military and then Latinos. Can you help us understand why the Hispanic population is disproportionately impacted by tobacco or smoking-related diseases and health conditions?
So I thank you, first of all, for the question, and thank you to PMI for sponsoring this. I think in many cases it's similar, right? In the military, I was one of those Air Force chaps that Harvey talked about earlier. A big part of it is the operational tempo. A big part of it is, having something to rely on, something to fall back on during those stressful moments. A lot of it is psychosocial, right? A lot of it is being able to interact with colleagues and family and friends, et cetera. We often talk about the holy trinity of chemicals, the chemical cocktail of caffeine, nicotine, and ethanol. So part of it is making sure that you have the opportunity to fall back on something, and whether it's a military member who's, in my case, having 12 to 14-hour missions on every sortie, you have the need to be able to get through it and maintain. Same thing with the Hispanic community. We've got a lot of folks in the community that are working 3 jobs, that have the need to be able to continue and maintain throughout a significant operational tempo throughout every single day. So getting them past the next several hours so that they can do what they need to do is part of their mission, if you will. I think the more that we can do then to be able to get away from the notion that abstinence is the goal. Abstinence is the goal, but it's not always sustainable. It's not always realistic. So giving them something that's less bad, less harmful, something that won't kill them necessarily, but will provide them that opportunity to be able to get through the next several hours and get to the next day.
Lindsay, tell us about your personal journey as a cigarette smoker, but you quit, because I know that this informs your whole take on the issue.
Well, yes, and thank you to the Hill for inviting me this morning. This is an important topic to the work we do at PPI. You know, we're why is a democratic think tank here talking about tobacco harm reduction? It's because we care about working people, we care about veterans, and you know, I come out of the campaign world. You live off of Diet Cokes and cigarettes. And I did that for 20 years of my life. And in 2018, I discovered IQOS thanks to some mutual friends, and it changed my life.
What is that?
IQOS is a heat not burn product that PMI makes, and you know, I tell the story to my close friends. I don't think I would have survived COVID had I not had IQOS. And I'm privileged. I have a good salary. I travel the world nonstop. I have access to these products. Why do our veterans not have access to these products? And, you know, I'll tell a personal story. You know, in 2018, I don't know if when you go to the doctor, you do those breathing tests. You blow and the balloons blow up. And in 2018, my lungs were 165 years old. Today, they're 53. I'm privileged. I have access to that. Why don't veterans do that? You know, we spent a lot of time going around the world. Last year I was in Poland at the distribution center for the US military going into Ukraine, and all the National Guard members there were smoking. And I asked them, why aren't you using other products? And they said, because I was told that they're not safer. Wow. And you know, I think we need to think about how we do that. Meanwhile, by the way, in Poland, you can walk down the street off the base, and pretty much they only sell the new products. They don't really sell cigarettes that much. So here's, you know, a complete disconnect from our government in not promoting it. So
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, we've heard these numbers all morning about how high the smoking rate is for service members, for veterans, and while it's dropping in the civilian population. So what, and this is a question for each one of you, what are we getting wrong here, and what needs to change?
I mean, you know, I think our nation as a healthcare provider, you know, my background's in emergency medicine, and I'm used to seeing traumas. And we don't necessarily see that anymore. We see a lot of chronic conditions. And so, you know, I take blame myself as a healthcare provider. We're not doing a good job educating the public, doing hands-on education with patients. You know, we see them for maybe 5 minutes in and out, and then that's it. And so, you know, risk reduction, harm reduction is a missed topic. We have so many opportunities. And, you know, the way I like to say it is, if you look at it from a big picture, if me and you were sitting here and, you know, we're having a picnic by a stream, right? And you see somebody drowning downstream, we're gonna go save them. Yeah. We see another person, we're gonna go save them. Eventually, me and you are gonna get tired.
Yeah, we're gonna go, where are all these bodies
Where are all these bodies? And so that's why we go back upstream and see why they're falling in. So get to the root cause of the problem. If we know lung cancer is the cigarettes are the number one cause of lung cancer, how can we reduce this risk? And again, I'm a realist. It is very hard to quit an addiction. I'm addicted to caffeine. You can see my energy drink over there, you know? It's very difficult. And you know, service members specifically, you have chronic stress, you know, you're on sorties and your sleep is terrible, you have no-go and fly status, you're taking uppers, you're taking downers to sleep so you can go on flights, and you're exposed to all these carcinogens. So think about your level of stress. Your cortisol is through the roof, your inflammation is through the roof, your immune system's just tanked because your poor diet, poor sleep, poor exercise. And so cigarettes are not the answer. If we can reduce their risk significantly by offering nicotine reduction, products like Zyn, like pouches, like patches, I mean, it's a lot easier to throw a patch in your mouth out in the field than it is to smoke a cigarette. And honestly, the dopamine rush is more sustained over time, over an hour, 30 minutes to an hour with a pouch in your mouth, whereas cigarettes, it's an instant trigger to your brain within 10 seconds. And as soon as that cigarette's gone, it's out. And so, to help mitigate that rush, things like nicotine pouches are an awesome alternative. And I say that as a healthcare provider.
Interesting.
But of course, if you don't smoke, don't start.
Don't start, right, of course. So, Danny, what do you think? I know that you are working with the VA to, among other things, to try to take different approaches based on the community you're talking to. Don't try this one approach for everyone, assuming it's going to resonate the same way.
So I think acknowledging that there are alternatives is the first step. I think making sure that people understand that even if you had been smoking for many years, that there are different alternatives, different options to be able to do less harm than what might be coming from that cigarette stick that you've been relying on for many years. I think approaching communities in ways that are more productive, more constructive, more efficient. Different communities have different approaches. In my community, for example, I think in some ways it's not speaking directly to the veteran, it's going through another veteran, or it's going through a family member, or it's going through someone that they trust. Being able to get to that trusted resource that can then tell the veteran or the active duty member, hey, what you're doing right now is doing more harm than good. You might be getting that initial rush from the cigarette, but in the long term, 20, 30, 40 years from now, you're gonna have significant health consequences. And having a family member say, hey, we want you to stick around, we love you. That makes a huge difference in some communities, so that they can then look at an alternative that hopefully is equally priced, because I think that's the other challenge that we're facing in some states. They're actually raising taxes on some of the cigarette alternatives, which is counterintuitive, right?
So that they're higher than the taxes on cigarettes?
Right, so you would think that something that is less harmful should be priced lower. So in some states, that's not the case. So, we should be able to look at a holistic approach to making sure that they understand that there are alternatives, that we're communicating with those populations. And if they choose to have a cigarette alternative product, that it's not priced out of the market for them.
Lindsay, what do we need to do differently?
I think, I'll say this, we live in the greatest country in the world, but our government communication on this issue has been awful, and we have to admit that. It's not been neutral. You even go back, to what came out in 2019 around E-Valley and how essentially illegal vapes were causing harm, but our government said it was vapes. And we have to do a much better job of correcting that and not making it just a neutral, let's just forget about it. As I talk to my friends, they still bring that up, that vapes are dangerous, they're gonna kill me. So we haven't corrected that. I will say, we live in the greatest country in the world, yet other governments are doing a better job. You go to some health clinics in the UK, and if smokers come in, they hand out these new products and say, please switch. Japan does the same thing. These are
You were saying that at US bases, they're not even available.
I
don't know if that's all of them, but.
I can only speak for Poland, and it was tragic to me as somebody who had switched, and there was this little smoking corner. I'm not even sure if it was allowed on the base, but there were 20 National Guard members sitting there smoking, and they didn't have the access to these alternative products. So I think we have to do a better job of correcting the record and saying these products are safer. I can prove that myself. And making sure that they're available. I mean, DC is full of buzzwords, and right now the buzzword is abundance. But what abundance really is making government work. And if we want to make government work, VA clinics should have the ability to access these new products. They should have people there telling them that if you are a smoker, here's a different way to get your nicotine fix. And that, to me, is what good government should be.
And Chelsea, as Lindsay said, as we heard all morning, these smokeless alternatives are less harmful than smoking cigarettes, but that doesn't mean they are harmless. They still have some risks of, just from a medical perspective, by way of educating anyone who is watching. Can you help explain how they do impact the body, and a little bit of what you touched on earlier, the difference between tobacco and nicotine, since some conflate the two?
Sure. So one of the best examples that I can provide of nicotine, so during COVID, I was a trauma nurse in Boston, tier 1 facility. We were bombarded with geriatric patients, and a lot of these patients we didn't have resources for, right? And so we'd started to see our patients decompensate really quickly. And a lot of them, it was cytokine storms, it was just chronic inflammation from COVID. And so I had COVID and I thought I was dying. Brain swelling, and then my husband tested positive, but he was fine. And I was like, this is unfair. And what we realized was all my symptoms were related to the inflammation of COVID. He did not have the inflammation because he was a nicotine user. And this is a published study that I did at Duke University. And so I went into work and I was like, well, Grandma is on her last leg and we got to do something because we don't have any other way to treat her. And so, as a nurse practitioner, we just started ordering nicotine patches. It was our last ditch effort. And
How did that work?
Not one died.
What?
That's a published study, Duke University. I'll provide you the link. And so while saying that is scientific suicide, that nicotine actually worked as a vasoconstrictor. I know, people...
Oh, hey.
And I'm willing to stand this fight any day. People who are systemically inflamed and are suffering from cytokine storms, that was our only option at that point in time to provide them. They couldn't have steroids because their kidney function was in failure. Now, one of those elderly patients died. And so in that aspect, this can go another way. If somebody has chronic hypertension, hyperlipidemia, if they have coronary artery disease, of course, you do not want to restrict those vessels. That increases your risk of stroke, it increases your risk of heart failure, it increases your risk of, a bunch of different things.
And that's what nicotine does.
That's what nicotine has the capability to do in certain at-risk populations. However, cigarettes do as well, tobacco does as well. And, my whole thing is, let's fix what's going to kill you the soonest, right? Priority number 1, don't get cancer. My father died from lung cancer from cigarettes. My mother was a smoker for years and was diagnosed with renal cell carcinoma. It is such a problem, and we know it's a problem. And so, you got to really look at the big picture. Is it safer to utilize nicotine pouches over smoking cigarettes if you're at an increased risk for cancer? I believe so. Personally, that's my choice. Professionally, that is my belief. Do I believe that it can increase your risk for heart disease down the line? Potentially, but so can drinking 400 milligrams of caffeine a day, which many of us do. So that's my belief on that.
Fascinating. Danny, do we need to be more holistic in tackling this issue? It's come up a couple of times this morning. Focus more on the why the veterans and service members smoke. Get to the root of that mental health cause instead of just addressing the symptoms, or try novel approaches. I know there was something on the VA website about, it was hypnosis. A veteran who'd smoked 60 years. He tried hypnosis, went away, just like that. So what are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely think that we need to be holistic, because it's not just tobacco use, it's suicide prevention. It's making sure that we can address PTSD. It's making sure that we can address, domestic violence and other issues. I think the more that we can do to decouple some of these pathologies from each other, I look to tobacco in particular, for example, when I was in the Air Force, that cup of coffee was automatically linked to the cigarette. The ethanol, the drink at the end of the shift or the mission, was automatically linked to the cigarette. So the social aspect of it has to be addressed as well. The sort of the norming of certain behaviors, we can adjust and we can adapt, and making sure that you don't have to automatically turn to a cigarette when you are getting ready for your mission, when you are coming off the mission, when you are having that cup of coffee. So decoupling those things is important. But I think all of it is related to each other, right? I'm concerned significantly about veteran suicide, for example. The more that we can do to be able to help veterans feel comfortable raising their hands and saying, hey, I'm not feeling that, I need help, removing the stigmas, You know, I deal with a community that has double stigmas, not just the veteran and military aspect of asking for help, but the whole macho community that I represent, letting them know that it's okay to raise your hand and ask for help.
Right, it's strong to ask for help.
Right.
Lindsay, you touched on this a minute ago in a little bit, other countries, what they're doing. Could you go in depth a little more on that, how they are dealing with this issue, and specifically tobacco harm reduction, and how it's working there? I think you mentioned Japan, and I think Sweden is somewhere where they're using it a lot.
Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating public policy research to look at this and say that Sweden, Japan will have no cigarette smoking in the next 5 years.
But
U.S. will still have 30 million.
in the next 5 years, so the entire countries.
I'm very confident of the way it's going. Cigarettes won't exist in these countries. The alternatives are what people are going to.
How are they getting there? How are they making that happen?
You know, I think it's great. It's great use of government communication, and they've told their smokers, their adult smokers, that there are these alternative products that are, you know, healthier for you or better for you is the better translation of the word, and it's dramatically, you know, you can go to Japan and 10 years ago, 65% of adult men were smoking, and that's been cut by almost 70% in 10 years.
I remember being in a restaurant in Japan, just a little hole in the wall, and you were sitting around the chef, and she was just puffing away while she was cooking. I was like,
I'm sure it was a great meal, though. And you know, not to lean too heavily on Japan, but two things have happened. One, the restaurants now have tobacco alternative tables. Wow. So there's no smoking tables, but if you want to, they don't have pouches there. But if you want to use a heat not burn, they have special tables for that. That's forward-looking government. The other fascinating thing with Japan is they sort of had this huge reduction and then they hit a plateau. What worked was the government and health folks saying, this impacts your neighbors, the smoking of cigarettes. And they've had this huge jump up in people not wanting to switch because they don't want to. We're not that good in the US. We don't really care about our neighbors that much. But in Japan, it was a cultural thing where you don't want to impact your neighbors. But I think it's tragic for us in the US that in 5 years, we're still going to have 30 million adult smokers. Many of them will be in the military, where the rest of the world is ending the use. And it's not because they're saying don't use tobacco, don't use nicotine. They're saying these are alternative products. Here they are. They're healthier for you. They're better for you. Let's switch.
So, policymakers, it sounds like this is who you need to connect with. I mean, are they connecting with your organizations on this topic? Wondering, Chelsea?
We're working on it. We had some good meetings yesterday, but you know, just to touch on the suicide aspect as well. You know, we know veteran suicide is a significant concern, and
Greater cause of death in combat.
The veteran, it's tough to compare active duty KIA with veteran-related suicides just because, you know, two different aspects. But one of the biggest issues is, you know, I'm guilty of this. We chase a high. I got out of the military and I was like, what next? What's next? What's next? And so, you know, I broke my back twice in the military. I shouldn't jump out of planes, but I'm addicted to the rush. And a lot of individuals who have had TBIs, even minor TBIs, concussions, you know, it decreases those dopamine receptors. So we have to seek a higher rush to actually fulfill that same feeling we used to get. And so when that dopamine rush crashes and it's no longer available, that's when you're like, well, what now? What now? And so that's why we have such a high rate of addiction behaviors. You know, addiction is very prevalent in the military. And so meeting with lawmakers and looking at it from a multifactorial perspective, like, hey, listen, we understand cessation is the best way to go about, you know, reducing risk and entirely, sure, but let's be realistic. Service members are stubborn, and they need a win. If we tell them you can't have cigarettes, give them something that they can have. You know, I'd rather have somebody use nicotine pouches than drink alcohol. Alcohol is one of the leading causes of active duty and veteran suicide. And so to help fulfill that gap of you don't need to fulfill that dopamine rush with pharmaceuticals, opiates. I believe that's a great conversation to have with lawmakers, and it will decrease in terms of 10 years. You'll see a significant decrease in overall, expenditures in VA, big time.
Danny, could you wrap for us?
So we do have conversations with lawmakers. We have several meetings on the Hill. We do bring up harm reduction, even though most of the conversations are wrapped around workforce development and entrepreneurship among veterans and health benefits, et cetera, veteran suicide and whatnot. We bring it up because it is related to everything else that's around whole veteran wellness, right? It's that holistic approach to making sure that we can keep them thriving in their lives post-military service. I think that the important thing is that making sure that the whole of government approach involves not just Congress, but also what's happening in the administration and the FDA and the levels of approvals that are needed. Because we do need to make sure that these alternatives, like the IQOS, like the Zyn, and all those products that are less bad, if you will, are available to veterans as they continue their journey towards wellness. But my concern is making sure that we're communicating with the veteran population and their families. I'm going to double click on what I said earlier. In some cases, it's better to be able to communicate with a family member of a veteran to be able to tell the veteran, we love you, want you to stick around for longer so you can see your children, grandchildren, et cetera.
Chelsea, Danny, Lindsay, thank you so much. Sorry we're out of time. We could go on and on, but fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I have another live interview. We're going to move a couple chairs here right quick, do a little reset. There we go. Sure. Go right ahead. I'll get a sip of water. And my next guest is Dr. Tom Price. If you recognize him, it's because he was HHS secretary during the first Trump administration. And anyway, welcome. He's also a consultant for PMI. So.
How are you? Good to see you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Price, so many people here today have personal stories, and I know you have one. Your father, well, let's see. Are we happy with the chair?
I'm good.
Your father was in the military, World War II. And he was one of the many service members. They gave him the cigarettes. That's when he started smoking. Tell us about his journey.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Thanks to the Hill and PMI for having this. This is an incredibly important issue and topic, and we couldn't spend enough time on it if we spent all day. My dad, this whole thing is personal for me. My dad, as you mentioned, was in World War II. Somebody mentioned that they gave the military gives you a lot of things. Well, one of the things that they gave him was Lucky Strike cigarettes. And he started smoking just like a lot of GIs in World War II and after. And he continued smoking almost until the day he died. He died at the age of 68 from COPD and emphysema.
Because of cigarettes.
Because of cigarettes, directly. I call them Lucky Strike lungs. And I mention his age and that story because both of his parents... 68.
That's not old.
Not old. And both of his parents, both of whom were born in the 1800s, in the 19th century, lived to be 98 and 99 respectively. Now, they never smoked, obviously. Now, I don't know how long my dad would have lived had he not smoked, but I promise you that it would have been longer than 68 years because of his gene pool. So incredibly personal for me. It's so important. And I know that there are stories throughout this room and with everybody watching that you know somebody who has likely been harmed by tobacco consumption in the form of
families
smoking.
who've lost people very dear to them.
Millions.
Far too early.
Exactly. We still have 30 million smokers in this country. 500,000 people die every single year. We spend $250 billion a year taking care of those folks, and 16 million plus continue to have some type of disease or disability related to smoking. And that's reflected in the veterans population as well and in active military.
Based on your father's experience, and then also based on what you saw when you were HHS Secretary, what do you think is the best way to bring down tobacco use, cigarette smoking in the military?
Vital question. First, you have to admit that there's a problem. This is about harm reduction. Every aspect of our lives, we participate in some sort of harm reduction. You get in a car, you put on your seatbelt, that's harm reduction.
We face risks and we make choices.
Absolutely. In the military especially. So much of what they do is to prepare harm reduction so that they put themselves at less risk than they otherwise would be. Cigarette smoking is the #1 preventable cause of disease and disability and death in this country, and yet we seem to ignore a harm reduction technique or opportunity in the area of smoking, which makes no sense.
About that. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a stigma around it. I'm a physician. My colleagues, as I think Dr. Urkel mentioned, somebody mentioned, the majority of physicians and nurses in this country believe that nicotine is a carcinogen. If you believe that nicotine is a carcinogen, causes cancer, and it's not, what are you telling your patients? You're not telling them the right thing, because if somebody smokes, and the combustibility of the tobacco, the burning of the tobacco is the problem for cancer and emphysema and COPD and all those things, but nicotine is not the cause of that, then why would you think that you ought to provide counseling for somebody that would say, if you move to a smoke-free nicotine alternative, that would be a good thing for you? And in fact, we don't do that. Now,
so education needs to happen?
Absolutely. I was going to
who
mention,
needs to do that?
Everybody, but government can lead the way. The FDA, the CDC I believe ought to be providing education for the population writ large about the importance of smoke-free tobacco products, nicotine products. And in our medical education, when I went to medical school, we didn't learn anything. I mean, I'm a dinosaur, but when I went to school, we didn't learn anything about any alternatives and whether or not nicotine was a carcinogen or not. That's not what was taught. Today, I suspect that the medical education for physicians in training and for nurses in training and others who are going to be seeing patients and counseling patients is not providing them the kind of education that would allow them to then provide appropriate counseling. And I say that because if they were getting the correct education, then I believe the results that we see right now would be different.
Because I guess what is accepted, I think, that what most medical providers would say, you're going to go through some counseling, some behavioral therapy, we'll give you some medications, maybe a nicotine patch, so it's the cigarette or it's quit.
Yeah.
And that's kind of binary choice.
Exactly. And as was said before, if you don't smoke, you ought not start. If you do smoke, you ought to quit. If you can't quit, then there's a continuum of risk of products so that you can decrease the risk to your health and those of others around you from a secondhand smoke standpoint, to move down that continuum so that you are able to consume something that satisfies that craving that you have or that habit that you have that makes it much less likely for you to develop the incredibly challenging diseases that people develop from smoking.
So is it just doctors who need to get this education?
It's everybody. It's the public at large. It's policymakers. You've heard folks talk about visiting policymakers on the Hill, which is incredibly important. There's a tobacco harm reduction caucus on the Hill, which is important for individuals to stand up and say, yes, this is something that I want to dedicate part of my policy career towards. But there's so much more that can be done in terms of that education, because if we were doing the right thing, we wouldn't see the numbers that we're seeing right now. Education within the military itself. You've heard folks give testimony about not being able to even find these products on military bases. That doesn't make any sense at all when we've got significantly higher incidence of smoking among veterans and among active duty military than we do in the general population.
So is it the concern about these products becoming a gateway, sort of a drug for young people to start smoking? Is that what's holding them back? Because obviously that's a valid concern. Sure. These are not products that do not have any negative impacts. They are less harmful, but they are not harmless.
They're much less harmful than smoking. And the youth concern is real, is a real problem that people cite. But the facts of the matter are that youth smoking is down incredibly, and youth utilization of these products tends to be very, very small. It's not the kind of experience that they get when they're smoking. So, but we've made huge strides in youth smoking right now. So that's a myth that needs to be dispelled, that the youth are going out and buying these products, because they're simply not. There are all sorts of things that are being done at the state level to prevent youth from utilizing these things appropriately, but there are things that are being done at the state level that aren't necessarily encouraging adult smokers to move in the direction, and that's where the
Such as what's happening?
Decreasing the taxes on education, certainly, but decreasing taxes. There ought to be a differential between the price for a pack of cigarettes and a similar amount of length of time utilization of a smoke-free nicotine product, tobacco product, so that individuals they know they ought not smoke from a health standpoint. We've done a pretty good job of educating them. But we still have nearly 30 million smokers in this country, and again, higher incidence within service members. So we got to give them more incentive to be able to move off of smoking cigarettes. You can do that from a financial incentive as well, and that ought to be lower taxes and lower prices for non-combustible products.
Do you think the Pentagon and the VA are doing enough? I mean, if they really wanted to stop cigarette smoking, I mean, they could just stop carrying them in the commissaries on bases.
They could, but you've got to have an alternative for individuals to be able to use. Because nicotine, as somebody mentioned, it doesn't cause those diseases, but it's incredibly addictive for some individuals. Mm-hmm. And if you have a nicotine addiction, then you've got to be able to get through that in some way. So you've got to have a product that's available for folks to utilize as they try to handle that desire and that need.
What about federal regulators? What role should they play in this? Do they need education?
Absolutely, and the FDA is front and center on this, and the Center for Tobacco Progress has made some progress, but there's a whole backlog of products that are out there, non-combustible.
Waiting for approval.
The numbers are astounding. It's like 86 products in that category that have been approved as of March 1 of this year. And there are thousands, almost 4,000 combustible products that have been approved by the FDA.
It's about
2%.
Wow.
Yeah, at the same time. So, and so there's so much that could be done. And again, what that speaks to is a lack of education and a lack of appreciation in the mindset of the individuals that are the policymakers making these decisions.
What about some of the issues that we touched on several of the panels? Tackling this more holistically, not just, especially in the veteran community, where people are using cigarettes in response to the stress and the anxiety and the depression, other things that they're dealing with.
Yeah, and you've got to look at the individual as it holistically, as you said, and recognize that they're utilizing these for some reason, whether it's a social reason, whether it's a prop, whether it's a need for the kind of stimulation or the feedback that they get from consuming them, and also recognize that there's an alternative, because the benefit that they are deriving, that they perceive they're deriving, is by and large related to the nicotine that they're consuming. So if you can do away with all of the harmful byproducts of the smoking of the cigarettes, all of those chemicals that were mentioned that cause the COPD, that cause the emphysema, that cause the cancer, that cause the decrease in ability to fight other diseases, why wouldn't we do that? It just doesn't make any sense, which again gets me back to the point of we're not doing enough education at every single level, because if we were, we wouldn't see the numbers that we're seeing now.
As we wrap up, what are your thoughts on how some other countries are handling this very differently and the level of success they're seeing?
This is the exciting story to tell. And so when you get individuals on the Hill or at other levels of policy making or at the VA or at the Defense Department, when you get folks to say, well, how do we know that these work? Well, you can point to real life examples, policy examples in other countries that have been astounding in the decrease in incidence of disease and the amount of money that they're spending on those diseases. So you've heard about Sweden and Japan, and as I think Lindsay mentioned, he believes I would celebrate the day if Japan and Sweden had no smoking within 5 years. That would be wonderful. But if you look at what they've done, it's 95% reduction in Sweden. It's a 70% reduction in Japan, just over a 10-year period of time. If we were to do that in this country, that means we would decrease the incidence of smoking somewhere between 3 and 9 million individuals would be left as opposed to 30 million individuals. So you think about all the challenges that people have from their smoking and what we could do as a nation in terms of public policy. Just look at what other countries have done and put in place the incentives for us to adopt the kind of programs that would allow us to move in that direction.
Former HHS Secretary Dr. Tom Price, thanks so much
Thanks,
for your
Kathleen.
insights.
God bless
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one final discussion, and this was one I taped yesterday with Congressman Rob Whitman. He is a Republican from Virginia and the vice chair of the House Armed Services Committee. So take a listen. Congressman Whitman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. We really appreciate the opportunity.
So you are vice chair of the House Armed Services Committee. I know that Virginia also has one of the highest concentrations of veterans in the United States. They make up almost 10% of your state's adult population. So how concerned are you about the very high rates of cigarette smoking among veterans and active duty service members?
Well, it's concerning. We know that smoking is one of the leading causes of preventable disease and death in the United States, and we know that the rate among military members and veterans is higher than the average. So what we want to be able to do is to make sure that our men and women that serve and today and those that have served understand the risks associated with that, also understand the alternatives out there for them, and make sure too they understand the health risks that are associated with that. I know in growing up, when I was in military training, it was just kind of cultural. Everybody smoked, and so did I. But then, looking at it, I thought it was a little bit ridiculous to do PT and then be dealing with the with the impacts of smoking. So I chose to go ahead and take a different path. So I think too, for military members today, it's important that we let them know what the alternatives are, and let them know too the health impacts, and help them along the pathway. We spend a lot of resources and time in the United States taking care of our veterans. One of the things we need to focus on is that preventative health care, making sure that they adopt healthy lifestyles, and that includes habits like smoking and their diet. So those are things that are incredibly important, and we spend a lot of resources in the United States treating veterans. We have to do more to make sure we get to the left of treating veterans and look at what we can do to help them get to these healthier lifestyles, help them pursue what are the alternatives to tobacco use, and letting them know too what the risk is.
Congressman, do you worry that the health effects of smoking, when they're so prevalent in the military, that impacts military readiness?
Well, it does. There's no doubt about that it has an impact there, and that's why it's important to let military members know what the impact is, especially too for many of them that have very physically taxing jobs, things that require high levels of physical exertion, and smoking certainly exacerbates that. And as I said, I experienced that myself, and I think military members kind of know that intrinsically. The key is how do we not just advise them on that, advise them of the health risk, but also we have to help them through pursuing alternatives to smoking. And there are lots of them out there, things that are much, much healthier for them, and can also deal with the things that are the hardest part about quitting smoking. You know, it's the nicotine addiction, it's the things, it's the sort of the physical act of smoking, all those things we have to be able to coach them through. And you know, the Veterans Administration for our veterans spends a lot of time in treating individuals. We should spend equal amount of time to help to coach them through this and get them to those healthier lifestyles, because we know the quality of life for them is going to be better and the health outcomes for them are going to be better.
So what more do you think that the federal government can do when it comes to, and I think you're talking about tobacco harm reduction, right,
Yes.
for vulnerable communities like the military?
Listen, I think the biggest thing is to let them know what are the alternatives, and then what are the ways that you can alleviate yourself from that habit, and how do we make sure that folks understand what are those pathways? You know, are there nicotine substitutes? Are there other things that they can replace smoking with that get them to that healthier lifestyle? As I said, the Veterans Administration does a lot in helping treat veterans for the diseases and the symptoms that they have. But what we need to do is more to help get our veterans to these healthy lifestyles. So there's an opportunity for the Veterans Administration to do more there. And also, too, for them to receive information to understand what are the healthier lifestyles. And that includes the active duty force. We ought to be doing more to let the active duty force know, by the way, here's a way that you can replace your smoking habit with something else. Here's a way, too, where you can feel better, your quality of life goes up, you can do better when it comes time for your PT test and all the things that your livelihood relies on. You know, you have to pass that PT test in order to continue to stay in the military. So, you know, we want to do things to help soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, and Guardians be successful. And the way we do that is to make sure they continue to pursue healthier lifestyles.
Congressman, do you think that the federal government is doing enough to support service members when they leave the military, especially when it comes to their overall health? I know that I believe in January you reintroduced several bills that would assist veterans with their health care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always think that we can do more. I mean, it's a challenge in today's world with all the information out there to make sure our veterans get, you know, timely information that's meaningful to them. You know, we have a number of bills that we put in to make sure that veterans have that access. You know, the Veterans Choice Accountability Act, which allows them to pursue a number of different treatment options. So not just those that go through the VA. I think, too, so that they can have that choice and understand, is there a place that they can get the care that they need that fits their lifestyle in the best way possible? You know, there are a lot of treatment courses out there that I think veterans ought to be aware of, and there shouldn't be anything that limits them from choosing the most successful course of action necessary for them to move away from these habits. So
that would give them more flexibility and maybe
yes,
even faster access.
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, and then we have the BRAVE Act, which you know, alerts vets as to, you know, opportunities for counseling to be able to get the things that they need to address, you know, some of the issues that they deal with, whether it's PTSD or whether it's habits that relate to risks to them from a health standpoint. So we want to make sure that those are things that are there to help them. And as I've said, those two bills that we have co-sponsored and have introduced and are now on the pathway to getting they're signed into law. We want to make sure that those are the opportunities there. So the answer is yes, we need to do more, and we can do more for our veterans. And those two bills there that I have been part of are those efforts to make sure that there are more opportunities for veterans to address these issues, you know, more than just the current path to say, how do I get treatment for an illness? You know, it ought to be as much emphasis on the preventive side. I think those things are incredibly important. You know, I worked in public health for 27 years, and I know that, preventing disease, those preventive measures are very, very effective in quality of life, but also in expenditure of resources. It's much less expensive to prevent something through a change in the course of behavior or other things that affect your health than it is to wait until the disease or the illness occurs and then treating it afterwards. It's certainly a much more expensive path. And then two, it's much better for the veteran or for the active duty military person to be able to treat it, to address the issue early rather than wait to have the disease or illness manifest itself and then go through the treatment process.
You know, as I mentioned earlier, I know that your state has a very large veteran population. What do you hear from service members when you speak with them? What are their biggest concerns right now?
Well, listen, we have some great Veterans Administration facilities here, a big brand new one opening up in Fredericksburg. So the VA's taken a lot of effort to make sure that our veterans are getting the treatment that they need. You know, what I hear from veterans is always, you know, what can we do to improve the quality of care? And then too, I do hear from them about, you know, what happens in the preventive health mode. What are we doing to help them, you know, understand what are the risks? What are the things we're doing to help them in pursuing those healthy lifestyles? So they look at both the preventive side and the treatment side and the things that we can do to improve what we do to support and help our veterans.
Now, Congressman, as you know, we are at war right now. We have service members in harm's way. I mean, as we speak. And so would you say, is there anything that we can do now, the federal government, the VA, the Pentagon, to make sure that when they return, that they have better outcomes than, say, service members have after past conflicts? I mean, as you know, since 9/11, 4 times as many service members and veterans have died by suicide as have died in combat.
Yeah, it's really incumbent upon us to do all that we can. The rate of veteran suicide, absolutely unacceptable. And the challenge is how do we make sure that when these brave men and women come back from conflict, that we are supporting them? You know, if you look historically about what's happened in the veterans community, when veterans have come back from a conflict, many times they come back as a group. And then they all come back in the communities as a group, and the communities are full of veterans, so there's a great self-support system there. In today's world, when they come back, you know, many times they don't come back with a group of veterans that they serve with. They come back by themselves. They come back on an aircraft, and that's a tougher way to go about, you know, getting the things that you need and sort of readjusting to life with the family and life in the civilian world. You know, if you're on an aircraft carrier and you come back with the aircraft carrier crew, you know, there's that community support and the things that you do as you go there in your post-deployment operations tempo and you go back to your families. But, you know, if you're coming back from other military units, many times you're coming back, you know, as an individual, maybe with a group of folks, but then you disperse, you go to your families, and then you get some time off before you come back to your unit. And, you know, I think that there's, you know, a need for us to look at how do we make sure we have that support system as soon as these individuals get back, not just say, oh, you know, go back to your family, everything will be fine, and then come back to your unit like nothing has happened. That's not the case. There's a great book out there by Sebastian Junger called Tribes, and he speaks about how our military members have really grown up in a culture where their military unit is very tribal. You know, the things that they do and the stresses that they face together, and the support of the tribe is really the people around you. And if you look at tribal societies, both here in Native Americans, but also around the world, you look at it and the support comes within those communities. And the challenge is how do we make sure that support continues for those individuals when they come back? You know, what you don't want to do is to divorce them from their military unit. You actually want the military unit and their families to be part of that support system when they come back. How do we make sure we do more of that? And how do we make sure the military is keeping close tabs on these individuals and helping them deal with the stresses that come with coming back? I mean, they've been in a very stressful environment in that conflict where their lives are on the line every day. And then they have to come back. How do we make sure we help them cope with that? And, you know, one of the outcomes of that is sometimes pursuing unhealthy habits, whether it's, you know, alcohol or whether it's tobacco, those kinds of things. So how do we help them not rely on those things? How do we make sure the community around them, including their military family, in addition to their family members, their wives, their sons, their daughters, their brothers, their sisters, their fathers, their mothers are there to help support them. So there's more that we can do in those areas, and that's incredibly important for us to understand the dynamic of what these military members face when they come back.
Oh, such an important issue. Congressman Rob Whitman, Vice Chair of the House Armed Services Committee, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And so that does bring us to the end of our program. I want to thank all of our wonderful guests for PMI US for sponsoring this, and to all of you who joined us in the room and those also watching online. If anyone missed any part of the discussion, the full event will be available on thehill.com. So thank you all and have a wonderful St. Patrick's Day. Take care.